Do you have a tribe of dyslexics within your family? Or can you trace dyslexia through your family tree? Well, today's guest speaker has done just that. Dr Judith Hudson has been studying intergenerational dyslexia through her work in Tasmania. Judith has spent over 30 years in the field of special education as an advocate for young people with developmental disorders such as dyslexia, dyspraxia and ADHD. She's a teacher, a psychologist, researcher and a writer in Australia and the UK, an educational ambassador and also a dyslexic ambassador to Square Peg's dyslexic support group in Tasmania. Judith also has a husband and a grandson who are both very successful dyslexics. She works and shares her time between Australia and Wales in the UK. Welcome to the show, Judith.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so pleased to have you on the show today, Judith, as I'm personally fascinated with the intergenerational dyslexia, as there are 3 generations within my family that have dyslexia, which we will get into discussing in a little bit. But first of all, would you be able to talk to us a little bit about the field of special education and how you got involved in working in this space originally?
Okay, well, I came to education late. I did 2 degrees when I was in my late 30s, education and one in psychology. And by the time I'd finished, although I was trained to be environmental scientist, the only job I could get was teaching children with special educational needs. And this was in 1981 when the UK was undergoing a big revolution. They'd had a survey done and a report came out with how badly we were serving these children, putting them in special schools and sort of shutting kids away. And we've got to move more towards the integration model. So this new label came out, special education. And I became a special education needs teacher to a school down in Kent where we had 340 students ranging from grade 9 to grade 11. At that time, I was working for an authority in the south of England who were quite wealthy and had lots of courses which you could go on. So not knowing a great deal about special education needs, because that hadn't been my subject, I went on a lot of courses, and they had just come up with this wonderful new thing to describe reading difficulty, and it was called dyslexia. And that was the first time I'd actually heard the D word. At that time, children were identified as having reading problems, and there was just a generic term. They were slow readers or poor decoders, whatever. But then they started to identify a certain group that had certain behaviours that were in common, and these fitted a profile that was under the label of dyslexia. It was a revolution. And in about 5 years, it had spread throughout the country. Dyslexia was being talked about, and some were denying it, and some were saying, well, it sounds quite sensible. And the debate was raging, and then it sort of added up to the economics of it all, that once you give somebody a label of dyslexia, you've got to do something about it. So it suddenly changed from dyslexia to specific learning difficulties. By that time, I'd got myself into another course, and I was studying dyslexia as a special educational need, but at the same time also looking at a wide range of special needs. So I worked within rural schools in Herefordshire and in Wales, working with children who had specific language and specific reading difficulties, doing assessments on them and devising programs. Then did what we call the intervention teaching block. So we assessed the child, we wrote up a program, we taught that program, and we worked with the class teacher to teach them how to teach the children in the way that they could learn. And that, by the end of the 90s, was sort of the model that was working here. They had appointed by this time another role in schools called the Special Educational Needs SENCO. And the SENCO was one in every school. And they were responsible for coordinating and identifying children's needs. And I used to be doing the identification and working with the Senkos in schools as well. Then I became a Senko myself for a year because a school that was struggling, I was seconded to them, and eventually stayed there till I retired. And at the same time, I'd been doing my master's with Professor Miles, Tim Miles, who was a guru in terms of dyslexia in the UK, and he supervised my master's research, and he became one of my supervisors for my PhD. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, really, that's sort of how I became involved. It evolved rather than, sort of, it wasn't a conscious decision. It just, one thing led to another. So I started studying dyslexia in 1981, and I still am fascinated by it now. And the more I know, the less I know. It's so frustrating.
So within the school system, do children have to be assessed by a educational psychologist, or were you able to assess them for dyslexia yourself?
Well, in those days, I was just a qualified specialist teacher. I'd done a specialist teacher course. Now, here in the UK, specialist teacher courses, if you're registered and successful on an accredited course, you have acceptance in terms of a professional standing to identify and assess children, especially for things like special arrangements and examinations. And I think it's probably more when you get to adult 18 and onwards, colleges and further education or higher education, that's more where the psychologist kicks in. Although it is still acceptable to have an assessment done by a specialist teacher, providing they've got the right qualifications. It's well controlled. We have the British Dyslexia Association and the PATOS, which is the Professional Association of Teachers of Specific Learning Difficulties. They both are the accreditors of courses that teachers can take.
Right. And so you did all this work in dyslexia, and then you happened to marry someone that was dyslexic, and you have a grandson that was dyslexic. Did you know your husband was dyslexic when you married him, or was that just uncanny chance? But I don't know if that's the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say. A freak occurrence.
A freak occurrence. Well, it's strange. It's a very strange shape because I have quite a circle of friends who are dyslexics, and it seems to be almost a common attraction. And I don't know whether it's conscious or unconscious, but Duncan reckons he wasn't dyslexic till he met me. So he's only been dyslexic for 37 years. My grandson, we went all through his schooling with Mum and I pursuing it through school. This is not right, this child. And of course, being a so-called expert, his granny probably put people's backs up. But Sam didn't get identified till he went on to education at 16. So he was almost 17 before he was actually recognised, although we'd known since he was little. He's very dyspraxic and he's certainly dyslexic. But the school wouldn't accept it. They just kept saying he's a boy. Even when he was 15, he's a boy and his spelling's awful and oh dear. But no, they wouldn't accept that there's... Of course, he appeared bright, Why? It's just lazy if he's bright, he can't spell, he's just not paying attention. But and he's gone on. He's actually written 2 novels under the name of Samuel L. Henton. They are the weirdest novels. They're science fiction. A lot of made-up languages and countries and very weird books. But he had a following on his pages of about 65,000. So, there's a lot of people out there that can relate to it.
Yeah.
I started proofreading his I did the first one, and halfway through the second one, I thought, if he's going to make a career out of this, he's got to get himself another editor. But I didn't understand the plots, but anyway, his reviews are good. So now he's out of the Navy, perhaps he'll do some more. I don't know. We'll see.
So it's interesting that... It's interesting that even though the UK is so much further advanced than Australia in assessing and diagnosing and early intervention, that you were saying before your son's in his early 20s, and he still took them until he was 16 to be diagnosed.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. And that happens. It happens quite a lot. It isn't necessarily the system's fault. A lot of places, yes, it is. But in some cases, they cope, they're managing, and will adapt to each of the sort of the transitions from primary into junior and junior into secondary education. But things can come to a head and sort of everything just goes scrambled when they get to a level that they can't cope with. I assessed a young man last year who's nearly a second-year medical student and had got that far through the system. And it all just fell apart. So it isn't necessarily the school's fault. Not in all cases. There is room to blame sometimes, the system, but also it can be that they've masked it so well as individuals and coped so well and developed strategies to cope that it doesn't get recognised. And we know how overworked teachers are. And if they're coping but keeping their head down, they're not going to be drawing attention to it. So, but I think Australia, it's moving faster now. I think in the last 5 years I've noticed the change is greater than in the last 15, but still a long way to go.
Yes, we talk about it a lot in a lot of our podcasts. So how did you end up working in Tasmania, of all places? Because whereabouts are you based in the UK? In Wales?
A place called Prestine in Powys, mid Wales, yes. Well, no coincidence. My best friend came on a teacher exchange to the Quaker school. She was at the Quaker school in York and swapped places with a teacher in the Friends school in Hobart. So they did a year exchange. So I came out to visit Jenny, stayed for 2 months, and at that time, I'd retired from teaching, but I'd started my PhD, excuse me, and I was also lecturing in higher education. So got involved at UTAS in the psychology department, and they allowed me to stay on as a visiting scholar for 2 months in working at their university as a base. And that was the first connection. That was in 2004. We returned for a fellowship I got for looking at ADHD and specific difficulties in Australia in 2006, 7, and then in 2009 I came looking at autism and got involved peripherally with dyslexia, because at that time there was just nothing in Tasmania at all. That there was not a spelled, there was nowhere for people to go, and sort of I dabbled, but there was nothing structurally in place. And then in 2013, when I was there, I heard about Square Pegs being formed. And in 2014, I joined them. My visas have varied along the way. Some are longer than others, so we've been able to spend quite long spells in Australia, and others we've had to leave every 90 days because we're only there as visitors. But we can go back 24 hours later, but it does interrupt things, and it gets expensive. Anyway, I got involved with the education faculty, doing lectures on special needs and dyslexia. But my involvement with Square Pegs meant that I could do a lot more getting into schools, because I wasn't part of an education department. I was a guest of the university as an honorary, and it was part of that wanting to involve myself with community engagement that sort of led to what I actually do now. But at the time, it was just Square Pegs. Oh, at least somebody is saying something and doing something. There was 2 parents that started this group, one very dyslexic with a dyslexic daughter and one with the dyslexic son. And there was so much to do, but they got so much energy, and we got quite a sort of a strong group around us, mostly parents. I think I was the only one that wasn't a parent or had parental issues. So again, I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And when you've spent your passion, your work in life, campaigning for something, and you find a niche like that. So I really, in a way, feel sorry for Tasmania, because I do go on a bit. But but they've made such strides, Square Pegs have. They really... We've been sort of doing some reviews lately of how far we've got, and we've been into 47 schools. We've done talks with over 2,000 teachers. We've run workshops. I've got a PhD student who's a wonderful literacy teacher, and we do workshops together when I'm over there, and those are really successful. And just raising the profile as much as we can. And dyslexia now is actually being spoken about. There's still pockets, because Tasmania has got rural dispersed, just like Wales. The schools are far apart from each other, the communities, but we're reaching out there. This last session that I've been over in Tassie, I was able to work with the country schools up in Bosworth. I can't remember the name now. So, but they made us very welcome, and we were expecting about 12 parents, and about 40 parents and teachers came, and we ended up, instead of spending an hour, my husband and I, instead of leaving at 4:00, we left at 7:30. We had supper, we had talking to people, and talking to grandparents. There were quite a few grandparents that come along, and it was, it was just amazing to see the need, and teachers that had come after teaching all day and had driven miles to be there, and that sort of spurs you on to want to do more, because if you're that committed, they deserve more information. They certainly deserve it. Yeah. But we've got multisensory learning scholarships this year. We've started. We've funded 7 teachers to do the IMSL course, and they are sort of spreading the word on how to teach. They're also doing 100 hours committed teaching, so we're getting that spreading further afield as well, and they're passing on information to colleagues on how to teach multisensory teaching, and it's growing. It's exciting.
And it's wonderful you've been able to join with Chatter Matters as well. The speech is down there with Rosalie, who's wonderful.
She certainly is.
Also, having Rufus Black now as the Vice Chancellor of Tasmania.
It was an absolute gift from heaven. I could not believe it when I was reading in the Mercury, the newspaper in Melbourne. I said, "Oh, look at this! We're going to have a dyslexic. Oh, fantastic!" And he's become our patron, of course. Yes. Yes.
So I don't know if you heard our podcast that I did with him, but it was wonderful to talk to him about his lived experience. It was fantastic.
Fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So with the dyslexia within your family, is that from one generation to another? Is that how you got involved in studying intergenerational dyslexia, or is it from 2 separate sides of your family that it comes from?
No, I think when I started doing assessments, really, and sort of started taking the family histories, that you noticed there was a connection. And I was so lucky that Professor Miles up at Bangor, he was a great advocate, and he'd been saying since the 1950s, there's a common pattern, these children, there's somebody else in the family. And of course, going back 1950, they were doing research and beginning to talk about it. And by the time we'd reached the 2000s, this hereditary link had become confirmed. So no longer were we saying there might be a possibility that it runs in families. We now know that it does. And when I was doing my PhD research, I was using 5 local families in an area where the population is pretty staid. So they were going back. I met not only with the parents, but the grandparents and in some the great-grandparents as well. And each of those had a history. so strong you couldn't ignore it. And they could go back talking about uncles or aunts that couldn't read or whatever. It was generally uncles or cousins. Yes, there were some aunts. Yes, there were some mothers. But more often than not, it was coming through the male line. And that was sort of quite exciting to see. By the time I'd sort of got all the information, it was a side issue in terms of something that I hadn't intended to look at. But because it was coming out so pronounced in my data, I decided, that we've got to start looking a bit further into what these families have got and sort of talking to them a bit more about it. And I think it's important that teachers believe and accept that it runs in families, because that's the first place you start looking, get a family history, and don't necessarily take for granted that the mother says or the father says no, there's nobody else, because when you start investigating, there are people. I started my study with 6 families, and the one student, male, he was 13, and Mum had said at the first interview, "Oh no, there's nobody else in the family." "Oh no, it's definitely not. It's." And then found out 3 weeks down the line, he came into the room when I was interviewing another boy, and they started sort of talking. I said, "Oh, you know each other?" And they said, "Yeah, we're cousins. Our dads are brothers." Oh, okay, right. So you need to sort of start exploring the family histories and sort of getting clues as to which sides of the family come. We have a lovely lady on the Square Pegs board who has 3 dyslexic children, a dyslexic husband and a dyslexic mother-in-law, but she's also got it on her side as well. And that she said, I had to study it because there's so many of them. And she's doing great work as well as a multisensory teacher. But it is a definite link. Is it on your side, your mother's side or father's side, or?
Well, my dad hasn't been formally assessed, but we are pretty sure it comes from his side, because he doesn't like to read, and from very early on he struggled to read, and he says that he really struggled at school, and he shows all the dyslexic strengths traits. So he's extremely creative. He's an amazing builder. So he shows a huge amount of characteristics. So we're pretty sure it comes from his side. We don't know whether any of his siblings, it's come out in any of my cousins. We don't speak to them enough to know, but one of my brothers has it. He was diagnosed after I was diagnosed because he was really struggling at school. So when my mum found out he was in early secondary school, so she went and got him assessed straight away, and he was diagnosed. Unfortunately, it was too late for him. He disengaged with school, and so he left quite shortly after that, which was a real pity. But he did go into TAFE and got a trade, and so that was really good. He stuck that out and became a builder. And one of my nephews was diagnosed very early on, so in grade prep.
Yes, yeah. So you can almost build a tree, can't you?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, so it's really, to me, it's really fascinating to see in our family. And then my youngest brother his girlfriend is dyslexic. So really interesting as well, because there's a big mix of us in our family. And so it's nice to have another girl that's dyslexic in our family, because we get to have a good laugh together. And so she was diagnosed in year 9 and had to move schools because of it. So it's interesting hearing, they didn't want her to bring the school level results down.
That is a tragedy, and an illegal tragedy. It shouldn't be allowed to happen, but it does. It does.
But she runs her own successful business now, and she's one of our young ambassadors, and she's just wonderful. But it's interesting in our family, the different stories, but the struggles my nephews had, and the amount, it's just so expensive. Even when a child is diagnosed, having speech therapy every week or having a tutor support in class, it's so expensive for parents.
It certainly is. And, for some parents, getting a diagnosis is too expensive.
Yeah.
And this is something that Square Pegs are sort of seriously working towards. How do we actually reach those people? Can we support, in part, the cost of getting a diagnosis? You can go to the psychology department of the University of Tasmania for an assessment, but there's a waiting list. They're assessing adults or children. There's a waiting list, so you could wait a couple of years to get it. And meanwhile, there's more and more damage being done.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I was assessed through uni, which I was really lucky because I was studying at the time, so it was a lot less expensive. But even through the foundation, we're looking at how do we lower the cost to have someone come and get assessed for us, because we know it's a huge barrier. Even as an adult, it's still really expensive because the psychologists, it's expensive for them. It's so time-consuming to do assessments. And I even know as a speechy, I mean, it takes so much time. By the time you do the assessment and write the report, you understand why it costs so much. But it's
absolutely
such a big barrier for people. And so I've been looking at how at the foundation you can look at, how do you subsidise it for people so that, whether the workplace helps fund it or whether you're able to access grants to help subsidise it. But it's such a big barrier when, so many people are out there that, if they could just get an assessment, it could answer so many questions for them.
That's right. Absolutely, yes. It's. I think it's interesting to see how universities are reacting in Australia. I mean, here, because we have the law on our side, we have to do certain things. We have to follow certain pathways. An adult can have a diagnosis quite quickly once they start in university. I've heard last year about CALE University up in Staffordshire that have a medical school that's a highly successful medical school, and a third of their students are dyslexic. They've got the best dyslexic department for supporting dyslexic students through their medical degrees.
Wow.
And that was wonderful to hear. I think, sort of our universities have gone a long way down the road, and that is a model that really must have happened and I'm sure there are universities in Australia that are doing it, but we need more.
We really need it on the MBS over here. I think that's where the foundation, we really see our role is helping to advocate for neuropsychs and educational psychs to have that on the MBS billing so that people can claim part of it back through Medicare. I think that's one of the best ways for us to work across the country is to advocate for that change so that it's more accessible for people.
Yes, absolutely. The sadness is with the school system, we work hard to get kids to sort of become advocates for themselves and sort of make them confident, and to see that dyslexia, yes, it's a disability, but it's a learning difference primarily. But then they get out into the real world and they've got to start saying they're disabled to get access to identification funding and whatever.
Yeah.
So having done one lot of 10 years of building up their confidence, they've then got to sign up to say that they are disabled people, and that is a conflict. There's a tension there.
It's a really interesting point you bring up, and we've even been having that discussion at the foundation because I strongly advocate for that word at the moment because of everything you're saying, because no one wants to use the word because a lot of us don't see ourselves as disabled. But if you want to create change and you want to get people listening, you need to use a strong word to be able to advocate for funding and for a seat at the table to talk about this issue. So, but people don't want to use the word disability. I mean, the word dyslexia isn't even on my report. It's a reading and writing disorder. So, in England, it's a specific learning difficulty. So there are so many different terms that we can use. And so I find it so frustrating because how can you go and advocate for something when you don't even have the right term.
That name.
At least
Yes.
for autism, they don't even have Asperger's anymore. You're just on the spectrum of autism.
Yes, and that's the way that dyslexia, dyslexia's got to go. But how do you make that transition?
And that's right. There are less people with autism. I think it's 1 in 200 that have autism versus 1 in 10 that have dyslexia. So, I mean, our population is huge and the need to help people with dyslexia is huge, yet we're arguing amongst ourselves just around the terminology still. So I find it really hard. So I think I have to use a hard word that causes a conversation and gets people agitated.
Yes.
So that at least, at least people are talking about it.
That's right, yes, yeah. That's one of the things that I sort of try and stress. We've actually got a course running at the university educating students with dyslexia and learning difficulties and getting the students on those courses to accept using the D word and to actually becoming so well informed that if anybody challenges them, that they can show the case for this condition or disorder or whatever, learning difficulty, there's a huge range of names out there, and the nomenclature, it really does confuse people because are you talking about the same thing if you're talking about a learning disability or an LD or a SPLD, all these umbrella names, just say it, dyslexia, but it takes a lot of courage because they said if they go back into schools using that word, their colleagues then get up, sort of, dyslexia, and we were there 15 years ago and we've moved on, and the dyslexia now is dyslexia and wonderful. But you've still got to have a disability when you're 16.
That's right. And it doesn't go away. It's lifelong. It's there forever. And I think we're advocating so strongly for dyslexia, but there are so many people that have the dysgraphia and the dyscalculia that, we have the mix of co-conditions that those other ones are getting forgotten and they all impact just as significantly on our day-to-day ability to function. Yes. So we're trying really hard to raise that awareness.
Yes, it's fantastic progress that they've now actually identified that these problems with dyslexia can spill over into your maths and dyscalculia, and wonderful that they've got all these names for these different areas. But if people see those as that disorder and dyslexia as that disorder, that's not helpful.
No.
It's all embracing, and that's where you have to go. Get people to accept it. Excuse me.
So you have a couple of PhD students that are working in this space at the moment.
I have indeed. I have actually three of my PhD students are dyslexic, ranging on different scales. The most severe is a wonderful person. He's a amazing advocate, and he's doing his PhD looking at provision in Scotland and laws in Scotland and policy making in Scotland, because Scotland do a lot for dyslexia compared to New South Wales. The population of the two, I think there's a couple of million difference, but looking at the geographical spread of New South Wales on a smaller scale in Scotland, there's a lot of similarities. He uses speech to text to speech so he can hear what he wants read out to him. But as he said, he has to play things several times and over again. It's very, very time consuming and it's not always accurate. Whereas if he's got somebody working with him who can read it and he gets to a bit where he doesn't understand, he can ask him to go back and go over that. And he cannot write. He cannot write coherently at all. So having somebody to write his words has released the information he's got. He's the most phenomenal memory. The things that he has stored in his brain It just never ceases to amaze me. But we work on a monthly meeting. Well, we're working fortnightly meetings at the moment. He has a supervisor at Flinders, and he has me, and he has his scribe. So we have our Skypes 4 ways, so that the scribe is taking the comments that he is making, and then we have a summary at the end of it in writing for the 3 of us or 2 of us that want that information. Jim stores it all in his head.
Yeah.
He's doing well. He's doing very well.
How did he access? How did he access his scribe? Was that just through his access and equitable? I can never get the word right. Access and equity. Yes. Is that the right word?
Did. Yes, he accessed him in the first instance when he was doing his masters at Macquarie. So they've worked together through 2 of his master's degrees, policy making and laws and social policy, all within that field. So they know how to work together well.
Yeah.
But it was the innovation of Macquarie in the first instance, I think, that gave him that access. But for Flinders to take him on, we tried several universities before we found one that would do so, and they became the first university to ever do this. So that's a major step in the right direction. I think South Australia are doing quite a lot in terms of dyslexia. I first went to South Australia to a dyslexia conference in 2004. On my first visit to Tasmania, I went over to Adelaide, and there was sort of a lot going on then, talking about, and my goodness me, it's grown since then. They're very forward-thinking. They are the first state to have say yes to the phonics screening check, which is they're the first ones to do it the end of this year. And that would be a major step forward for the whole of Australia, because it picks up struggling kids at such an early age that you can adapt your teaching and you can adapt things for them to actually bring them up so that they're at least coping with the acquiring literacy alongside their peers. But if you just ignore that, the differences are going to get wider and wider very, very soon. And the damage is done to the social and emotional side of the child as well. One of the things that is sort of a major stumbling block with children with learning to read, dyslexic children learning to read, is this awareness of sounds within words and this phonological processing. And the phonics screener, it is not a test. It's not another set of criteria like the NAP plan. It is a way of seeing how children decode sounds at the end of a year of instruction. And it shows the teacher where they need to put in an intervention or where they need to adapt their teaching. It doesn't show up bad teaching or poor teaching and all sorts of things I've heard thrown at the wall why they don't want it. It doesn't do anything but positive. It identifies the children who are struggling, and it identifies them at a very early age. And the phonics screener is really a way to go forward.
And so is the phonics screener across the whole of the UK?
Whole of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have their own education systems, but it's certainly over the whole of England, yes. Okay. And they've been doing it now for about 5 years, I think. It is showing improvements in reading, but marginal. But what it is showing is the teaching is improving, that teachers feel more confident in the way they teach literacy. And that's a good step forward as well.
Yeah. And so, sorry, we digressed because we were talking about your PhD students, because you said you've got 2 other students who I'm excited to hear more about them. I'm being selfish on my podcast tonight because as my listeners know, I'm doing my PhD as well. So I'm just keen to know a little bit more. And for any other dyslexics or dysgraphics or people with dyscalculia out there that are trying to do their any studies really, to hear a little bit more about your students, and if you've got any key suggestions that you've given your students that might help our listeners that might be studying out there at the moment.
Okay. Well, one of my students is doing comparing or hoping to compare what goes on in schools these days compared to his days. Two of the three have got stories about their own experiences that are really very, very disturbing. And they're both looking to see where change will come. The biggest problem is with their time management, and certainly the one person is a very poor timekeeper in terms of every step we make, she misses, but she's getting better. Supervision, in terms of supervising, you have to be very careful that it's not a constant nag. It's that I'm trying to encourage. I'm not condemning or making a judgment. I really want them. If I say I want this by a certain date, I really do, because for your benefit. So try and understand your supervisor's position, but also to keep your supervisor informed. If your supervisors know how you work, what strategies you're using, they'll appreciate why it takes so long to do something, or why you go off at a tangent because of, and it's the way the dyslexia brain works, you know. If they understand that, if they're aware of it. So I'm not saying always bang on about, well, okay, I can't do that because dyslexia. That's not what I mean. If you can inform them in a positive way that this is how I do something, and although it would only take some people probably a week to do that, it's going to take me 2 weeks, and sort of negotiating your time management that way. It's really an agreement, if you like, but an agreement based on understanding. When I've got something sent to me in terms of grammar and spelling checks, that they've put something through the spell checker and the Grammarly, and it's still sort of not coming out in the way they want it, I don't mind changing things around, but I have to have their confidence and trust that I'm not destroying their work. I sent one piece of work back to somebody who rang me straight away and said, I'm failing this, aren't I? I'm failing, I'm wasting my time. And I had done so much damage by being what I thought was helpful. It had to be worked out between us that this is what I was trying to do. But it doesn't say what I wanted it to say now. And it's having that, the key to sort of, well, no, the message is there, but it's now in a language that everybody's going to understand.
Yeah.
I'm very good at dyslexic spelling and reading checks, because Duncan was an examiner. He was a chemistry teacher. He's now retired, and he's very happy about that. But he also used to mark exam papers for the examinations board, and what happened then was they started putting 5% of the marks could be deducted for spelling and grammar. And as he said, who am I to say it's spelled wrong? So you get called in a bit.
Yeah, it is hard. Even I'm trying to write my speech for our gala in 2 weeks, and I read it to my sister. She's like, oh, it's got to all be restructured. And I said, yes, but you can't take out this part and this part and this part, because this really means stuff to me. And that's the thing, is when you send it off to people, I don't mind so much with my doctorate because I know it has to read a certain way. But it's when it's other work and people take away, because you know what you want it to say and the meaning. Yes. But it's just not articulated well, and so you know that it adds.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It must be so frustrating for you. But stick at it. Stick at it.
Yeah, it is, but it's I'm learning now to say no. You need to, or I'll go back if someone's rewritten it, and I really want that point to be in there. I'll go back and put it back in.
Yes.
And that's what I'm just learning to do. I'll go back and put it back in and try and rework it so it makes sense.
Yes.
But I'll go back and I'll put it back in how I want it. I'm stubborn. So that's my problem.
Do you find it's easier to sort of express things in face-to-face than it is to put a concept or something into writing?
Yeah, I can't put it in writing. It can take me hours and hours and hours to try and put one sentence, and then I can explain it to someone and they can put it in words in a minute, and I just find it so frustrating because I just think, why can't I just be like that?
Yeah.
So,
No.
It can, and it just takes, I find it more, it's just the time. It takes so much time to try and articulate sometimes one sentence or a paragraph because you're trying to find the right words, or you've rewritten it so many times because you know exactly how you want to say it and it just doesn't come out right on paper.
Yeah.
And in the end, I normally have to call someone and I explain it to them, and then they will say it in a way that I should write it. And then it just takes 2 minutes. Like I was writing my pamphlet to go out to the gala. It's our new DL flyer for what we're doing at the foundation, and we're doing stuff on research. And I rang my content editor and said, no, that's not how this is what it needs to say. And within 2 minutes, she'd rewritten it for me. But I just couldn't articulate it. But as soon as I said it to her, she said, oh, yeah, just say this.
Yes.
But I have to call her at 7:30 at night when it's her dinner time to say, I'm sorry, that's not what I was trying to say to you. It's this. And then she just fixes it in 2 minutes. And I just think it just takes everyone else so much time as well, which I feel bad then that I'm taking up other people's time.
But this is where a lot of problems lie in schools, that teachers just don't understand that the energy that's going in. I mean, the processing you've just described, if a teacher's saying, yes, but it was due to be handed in on Monday and it's now Friday, that doesn't help either, does it?
No, and because we're disorganised anyway, like in our minds, and my dad's a really good example that, it takes him so much longer to do things, but we think we've got enough time. So we might, in our brain, have planned out everything to a T and think, okay, we're going to start it on this day because in our brain, it's going to take X number of days to do it. But when we actually sit down to do it all, it actually takes so much longer.
Yes.
To do it. But in our brains, we've mapped it out and it makes a lot of sense. And we think, no, it's going to work exactly how we planned it. But when you sit down, you go, actually, no, it's not. But you think you've done it right and you think you've planned it right. So that's frustrating as well because you've done the best thinking you've planned it out right, and then it doesn't actually end up till the last hour going, but I know I planned it, but it just doesn't work.
But this is sort of, speech to text and text to speech. It's a wonderful invention, and I'm not sort of saying it isn't useful. It's extremely useful, especially for dyslexics. But it also highlights another problem, that the structure of what you're saying isn't right, and it sometimes doesn't say what you thought it should have said, even though you dictated it or whatever.
Yeah, and that takes time.
You have to learn, and that takes time, yes.
And you've got to build that in. If you're using text-to-speech to do your editing, you have to, because it takes time, it's a slow system to proofread to you. Like for me, it would take at least, 5 minutes a paragraph to listen to it, to see because I can hear the mistakes when I can't see it, but I can hear it. So then I've got to hear and see where it is because I've heard it, then I've got to see where it is, then I've got to go back and edit it. So if that's 5 minutes per paragraph, that's a lot of time.
Yes, and a 2,000-word assignment. Yes.
So it's a lot of planning, and so it might be that the person's done all the planning, but when you add up all that time,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you use audio recording very much? Sort of putting your ideas in by dictating them onto
I've
the computer?
started to. If I'm going for a walk or something and I come up with an idea, I'll audio record it now for bits and pieces. But it's hard because I'm old school, and I shouldn't say this because we're talking on podcasts all the time. We're talking about assisted technology and all the wonderful things out there. But because I think I got diagnosed late, I developed all my strategies. And so when you've got strategies, you also have bad habits. Bad habits are hard to break.
They certainly are, yes.
And my default is my mum for editing.
Oh, lovely.
So it's learning to put all this wonderful technology in place, because I'm just so used to defaulting to human beings to help me, and I'm very lucky that I've been able to do that. I've got a great network of friends and family that support all the work I do. But I should be using technology a lot more than I do. I just haven't had anyone to show me, really, so you've got to work it out yourself.
Yes, I was going to say, Sam, my grandson, he sort of embraced technology by hit and miss. It's just trial and error. He does something and you say, oh, okay, how do you do that? Well, I don't know, I just did it. So he cannot tell you how he does things. So using the technology is only useful to him in that way, but it's not any use to anybody trying to see what he did to do it that way, because he can't show you. He just did it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
He might have done something about 20 times before he actually did that, but that was trial and error. Eventually he got there. It's not afraid of technology. In fact, it's sort of, that's the area he's been working in the Navy. But it's an acquired skill using assistive technology, and that takes time. So time is the biggest problem for dyslexics. There's never enough.
No, there is never enough. No. Is there anything you'd like to see change in the next 5 years, or anything you'd like to say about the work that Square Pegs is doing in Tasmania before we sign off tonight?
Yes, just a little bit. The work they're doing in Tasmania is going well. We need to recruit more people who are going to be facilitating more training on the ground, as it were. I think we as a strength could work on actually advocating for more change, and especially in terms of, I spoke briefly about the phonics screening check. Literacy in Tasmania has been a problem for many years, or achieving a successful literacy rate amongst children in Tasmania, and it's appalling. It really is, and that has got to change. I would love to see Tasmania changing from the present way of teaching literacy, which is more like whole language. I'd love to see more phonics teaching, and certainly advocate the screening at an early age, but we've got to train the teachers. We've got to give teachers more support. The Department of Education are doing something which I think is quite innovative. We have a grad cert for inclusive education, which we've campaigned for. Chris Rayner, Dr. Rayner, who's the head of inclusive education in the education faculty, or the School of Education, he's negotiated that the department pay for 25 teachers a year to do this grad cert. It's 4 modules, and one of them is the dyslexia one, and they've just committed to, we've had it funded 3 times already, and we are going to run it now for them until at least 2023. Which yes, it is. So there are more and more people being trained, but we've got to train teachers. the B-Teach, the ones before they go out, we've got to teach them how to teach reading, how to teach it effectively, how to understand what understanding phonological awareness is, to understand the mechanics of the language, so that they're confident when they go out that they can teach children how to sort of decode and what sounds, the importance of sounds are. So I'd love to see us put more pressure on changing the system from within, excuse me, to actually get recognising that schools need more support. And yes, we've got 25 teachers a year being trained, but that's got to change even more within their own system. So the schools need more training. The whole school communities raising awareness, and I'd like to see that grow a bit more. We've got 5 parent family groups now around the state. I'd like to see those continue growing because people need that information. If the parents are skilled up, if they are aware, if they are informed, they can advocate far more successfully for their child. And if they advocate for their child is seeing that advocating going on, and that rubs off on them. So, you know, it's, as an advocacy group, I think that is one of our strengths that we really need to work on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty much it at the moment. It's the big ask. So we've got to improve how we teach our teachers. We've got to improve the way we teach teachers how to teach reading. And if Square Pegs can advocate for raising the awareness of dyslexia and getting it recognised, and then work on the rest of the things like funding some or working on getting this recognition so that parents can get some support towards getting their kids identified. So that's a small ask, isn't it?
No, not at all.
But you carry on with your good work. I think, you know, so the more people like you that spring up, the little beacons of hope there. You know, 10 years ago, names in dyslexia or in specific learning difficulties around Australia were few and far between. Now there are a lot more names springing to mind that, you know, people are doing things. Lorraine Hammond over in WA, she's doing fantastic things, training schools. Sarah Assam in Bentley West, she's doing amazing things, her and Steve Capps. You know, it's growing and it's got to grow, it really has. And South Australia, you know, so I mean, Tassie is a small state with a very small population, but very big problems. And unless we sort of make a stand, those problems aren't going to go away soon.
No, they're not. That's why we're doing as much as we can to support Tassie, because we want to make sure that, you know, they're getting as much support as they can down there, because we know that there's a lot of literacy issues that they're facing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was so wonderful to talk to you and to hear about your research and your students that you're working with and your family story around dyslexia, and the work you're doing in Tasmania with Square Pegs and Chatters Matters. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Judith, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you
and
for now.
Good night. Good night to you.
If you would like to know more about the wonderful and thought-provoking research that Judith has undertaken, head to the Dear Dyslexic website. If you would like to find out more about Square Pegs, go to squarepegstas.org. Also, if you haven't already done so yet, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with all the work that we are doing at the Foundation. Head to deardyslexic.com. And don't forget, if there's anything you've heard today that you've found distressing, you can contact Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline 13 11 14. Thanks so much for joining us today, and until next time, bye for now.